The following is a paraphrased version of the provided video script, with slight changes to word order while maintaining the same style and articulation. They claimed it was only a fever, and the doctor's file noted this twice. But a fever doesn't last for months, nor does it kick inside a 10-year-old girl's stomach. When the midwife was finally called, it was already too late to conceal what the family had done. The thing that crawled from that Appalachian cabin in the dark didn't just haunt the valley, it cursed it. For over a century, no one dared to ask where that child came from or who its father truly was. Hello, everyone. Before we begin, please like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your location and the time you are watching. This helps YouTube continue to show you stories like this one. They lived on the edge of Breath County, Kentucky, where the trees grow thick and the roads disappear into silence and brush. It was 1892, and the Blackburns had no neighbors for 8 miles. This was no accident. The land was unforgiving, the winters were cruel, and the stories were even crueler. People hadn't forgotten what they'd heard about old Reuben Blackburn, how he'd lost 3 wives and buried them all behind the barn without a preacher, how his brother was found frozen to death with his eyes open and his boots missing. But what they whispered about most was his daughter. Her name was Clara, and she was born silent, small, and pale. The fact that she didn't cry when she entered the world was enough to start gossip. But it was her eyes that truly disturbed people, one brown, one slate gray, both ringed with a strange yellow hue, like a candle left to burn too long. They said no one in the family had eyes like that. No one, except Reuben himself. She didn't attend school and never played with other children. She was kept on the farm, taught to cook, clean, and never speak unless spoken to. By the time she turned 10, she still hadn't visited town once. But one night in the middle of March, a knock came at the doctor's door. It was Reuben, wild-eyed, his coat soaked in blood, muttering that his daughter was sick with a stomach ailment. When the doctor arrived, Clara was lying on a bed of hay, her small body heaving. But she wasn't dying, she was giving birth. The midwife said the baby came too fast, as if it had been ready for weeks. The infant was stillborn, twisted, with its mouth wide open. And Clara? She never said a word, not during the birth, not after, not for the rest of her life. What happened that night was never recorded in any official file, but the midwife wrote 3 words in all capital letters on a slip of paper she kept hidden until her death, not her fault. After that night, Clara disappeared. Not literally, she still lived in the same rotting house at the edge of the woods. But the girl everyone had whispered about became something else entirely. Those who dared to visit the Blackburn property said she moved differently, more slowly than before, as though her bones didn't work as they used to. Her skin paled even further, and her hair, once thick and brown, began to fall out in clumps before her 12th birthday. But the strangest change was her silence. Clara had never been talkative, but now she didn't even respond to her own name. Reuben, however, was a different story. In the months after the birth, he became even more erratic, volatile, and cruel. He was seen shouting at no one in the middle of the woods. At one point, he locked himself in the cellar for 5 days, emerging and muttering something about keeping the blood pure. And while people had always been suspicious of him, the rumors had now turned poisonous. Folks began to connect the dots. Reuben's last wife, Martha, had died giving birth to a stillborn boy who reportedly had a twisted spine and no ears. That was 6 years before Clara's labor. But now people whispered whether Martha was even Clara's real mother. Some said Reuben had made Clara the same way he'd made that baby, in secret, in sin, in silence. There was no birth certificate, no marriage records, only a grave behind the barn and a child whose eyes matched her father's. The community had one rule: if a family crossed a certain line, you didn't confront them. You simply made space, quietly. Reuben had built that space himself, miles of it. But what haunted people most wasn't just what happened to Clara, it was what began to happen to the land. Fields where nothing would grow. Mutilated animals were found. A boy from town went missing after hunting near the Blackburn property, and his body was never found. And then there was the preacher's wife who swore she saw Clara walking barefoot through the cemetery one night with a child cradled in her arms, a child no one ever saw again. By 1895, the Blackburns were no longer just recluses, they were cursed legends. In the years that followed, even the county records began to disappear, burned, misfiled, or simply erased, as if someone wanted the entire bloodline buried, not just the baby. It wasn't until 1911 that a name surfaced again, Elias Blackburn. The census taker recorded him as head of household, age 16, and an occupation of laborer. But the town clerk noted something strange in the margin: no known parentage. Said to be Clara's son. No father listed. By then, Clara would have been just 29, but the townspeople claimed she looked over 50. Her teeth had yellowed to stubs, her back was hunched, and she wore thick layers in the summer heat to hide what they called her scars. No one knew who the father was, or at least no one said. Some suspected she'd been taken again. Others whispered darker things, that Elias wasn't a new child at all, but a second birth from the same unholy lineage, a continuation of a cycle that started long before anyone alive could remember. Elias didn't talk much either. He never went to school and worked odd jobs around the mines and fields, but he never lasted long. He was said to have a strange odor, something was just off about him. Animals avoided him, and children screamed at the sight of him. He wasn't violent, at least not outwardly, but there was a coldness to him and a familiarity. Several townspeople swore that Elias's left eye matched Reuben's perfectly, the same grey ring, the same waxy sheen. But by 1915, Reuben had been dead for nearly 18 years. Elias built a shack behind the original Blackburn home using old barnwood and rusted nails. He lived alone, though townsfolk claimed they sometimes saw a girl in the window, pale, thin, and unmoving. She never came outside. She never aged. And some believed she wasn't alive at all, just a memory he couldn't bury. That same year, a traveling photographer passed through Breath County and captured a handful of images, one of the church, one of the mountains, and one uncaptioned photo of a boy standing in front of a leaning shack. He stared directly into the camera, one hand at his side, the other clutching something wrapped in burlap. When the photo was developed, the photographer tried to recall what he had seen. He said it looked like a doll at first, but then he noticed the hand, small, human, and missing 3 fingers. The photo never made it into the archives, it was pulled by the editor without explanation. But one copy remained, unearthed 90 years later by a genealogist. When the image was shared online, a forum administrator quickly deleted it. The reason given: too disturbing, possibly real. In 1933, Kentucky was deep in the Great Depression. But in the hills above Jackson, the Blackburns were still barely spoken of, except in whispers and warnings. Locals said the line hadn't ended with Elias, that he'd taken a wife, though no record of a marriage was ever found. She was said to be mute, thin as bone, with skin so pale it reflected moonlight, a woman from nowhere, with no family, no history, and no name anyone could remember. By the time she appeared, Elias had boarded shut the windows of his shack and hung animal bones over the doorframe. The structure sagged with mildew, rot seeped up through the floors. And yet, somehow, they kept having children, 3, to be exact, 2 daughters, 1 son. None of them were registered, and no doctors were ever called. The only proof they existed came from a schoolteacher who claimed she saw the oldest girl in the woods one morning, wearing a long wool dress and dragging a rope. She said the child didn't speak, just stared. When asked where her home was, the girl simply turned and walked back into the trees. But what the teacher remembered most was the girl's face, how it looked all off, not in a monstrous way, but subtly wrong, as if someone had rearranged the features of a normal child and hadn't gotten the proportions quite right. Then came the house fire. In 1939, a neighbor saw smoke coming from the Blackburn shack just before midnight. By the time anyone arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. There were no screams, no signs of panic, just fire. After it was out, only ashes remained, ashes and a single intact floorboard, scorched but unburned. On the underside, someone had carved 13 names, most of them unfamiliar. One was Elias. Another was simply CL. But among them was one name that chilled investigators: Reborn. The coroner found no bodies, not even bones. He listed the deaths as presumed, but the report was left open and unsigned. Months later, someone broke into the town archives and tore out 5 pages from the Blackburn file. To this day, no one knows who did it. But the next morning, a message appeared scrolled in charcoal on the chapel door: "The blood stays pure." In the decades that followed, the Blackburn name vanished from public record. Not a single trace, no birth, no death, no land ownership. It was as if the family had dissolved into smoke. But if you ask the locals in Breath County, especially the older ones, they'll tell you it didn't end, it just went deeper. A man named Chester Boyd, who worked for the electric company in the late 1950s, once told a reporter about a strange service call up near the old Blackburn land. A new structure had been built, modern, square, and with no windows on the side facing the road. It wasn't marked on any maps. Chester knocked on the door. A young man answered, thin, barefoot, with eyes the color of stale milk. Chester asked who lived there, and the boy replied, "My mother's father built this land. We never leave it." When Chester asked if they needed electricity, the boy smiled. "We don't let the light in." No further service was performed. Chester never filed the report and left the job 3 months later. But he wasn't the last. In 1972, a geology student from Berea College went missing while doing research near Blackburn Hollow. Her name was Mara Keyes. Her journal was found inside a fallen log weeks later. The last entry read, "I saw them. 2 girls, same face, same dress. They stood on either side of a stump just watching. One of them mouthed something to me, no blood left." Her body was never recovered. The town sheriff at the time, William Poe, began a quiet investigation. He reviewed the old Blackburn files, cross-referenced census records, and dug through land deeds buried in the courthouse basement. What he found disturbed him enough to retire early and leave the state. Before he left, he gave one interview. When asked if he believed the Blackburn family still existed, he replied, "Not like you and me. Not in the way people expect. But yes, they are still here. What's left of them remembers." To this day, post notes remain sealed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. In 1998, a new piece of the Blackburn puzzle surfaced, and it didn't come from Kentucky, it came from southern Ohio. A nurse named Gloria Ferrell submitted an anonymous tip to a regional genealogy journal. In it, she described a young female patient, around 14 years old, who was admitted to her hospital under emergency circumstances. The girl was malnourished, barely coherent, and, most disturbingly, 7 months pregnant. When questioned, she couldn't recall her last name. But when shown a map, she pointed directly to a spot on the Kentucky border, an unmarked patch of woods west of Jackson, the same region where the Blackburns once lived. Gloria's most haunting detail wasn't the pregnancy, it was the girl's appearance. She had mismatched eyes, one brown, one pale gray, ringed with yellow, just like Clara. She also bore scars, linear, patterned, deliberate, not the kind made by accident or punishment, but the kind that looked ritualistic. Carved into her back were 3 small symbols. Gloria sketched them and submitted them to the journal. Days later, the journal was pulled offline, with the editor claiming unauthorized content had been leaked. But a few researchers saw it first. One of those researchers was a folklorist named Dr. Mitchell Langley. He'd spent 20 years studying Appalachian bloodlines, particularly isolated families with signs of generational mutation. When he saw the symbols, he recognized them immediately, not from science, but from a regional oral tradition rarely documented. The carvings matched a ritual known only in whispered legend, the womb seal, said to be performed on young girls within certain inbred clans to keep the blood from spilling too far. It wasn't a warning, it was a boundary, a way to contain something old, something sacred, or something cursed. Langley went public with his findings. A week later, he went missing. His vehicle was found burned out near Pine Mountain. Inside were torn pages from his field notes and one photo, old, cracked, and water-stained. It was the same image taken by the photographer in 1915, the boy standing outside the shack. And in the corner, faint but visible, was a second figure, a girl, half hidden in shadow, holding what looked like a bundle wrapped in cloth. Her face was turned, but one eye was looking directly into the lens. It was grey. Today, the Blackburn land is overgrown, choked in bramble and moss, and barely accessible by foot. There are no marked trails, no signposts, just a hollow silence broken only by the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Locals avoid it even now, not out of fear, at least not the kind they'll admit, but out of instinct, a bone-deep warning passed down through generations: don't go where the blood remembers. But once a year, always in late October, strange things still happen in the valley. Campers report hearing soft lullabies echoing through the trees, no source, no words, just a slow, rhythmic hum like a child being rocked to sleep. Hunters find animal carcasses arranged in patterns, circles, triangles, crosses, with no sign of predator or decay. And hikers speak of sudden feelings of nausea and vertigo when they pass the old Blackburn boundary line, followed by an overwhelming sense that they're being watched. Most dismiss it as folklore, just a story, an old ghost tale to scare kids around a campfire. But there's one more piece of evidence, one that never made it into public archives, found not in Kentucky but in Pennsylvania, inside a sealed asylum logbook from 2007. A patient, female, age unknown, was admitted after being discovered wandering along a rural highway, barefoot and covered in ash. She was dehydrated, nearly catatonic, but physically unharmed. Her file marked her as Jane Doe. Her only words, spoken 3 days after admission, were written on a scrap of paper and stuffed into the seams of her mattress. They read, "He was my father and my brother and my son. I am what's left." The attending doctor listed her as mentally unstable, and no follow-up was conducted. But years later, a nurse on night duty snapped a photo of the woman during a rare moment of awareness. Her face was sunken, her hair was brittle, but her eyes, one brown, one pale grey, rimmed in yellow. There are some stories that don't want to be remembered, that hide in bloodlines and decay in silence. But sometimes they resurface, not for answers, not for justice, but simply to remind us that the past is never gone. It's in us, watching, waiting.